At 4:24 hours local time, 34 Ukrainian AN-196 Liutyi drones tore through the sky over Chelyabinsk, Russia, skimming close to the ground at an altitude of 250 feet. In just a few minutes, they would teach the air defense system Russia proudly called one of the most advanced in the world a $1 billion lesson in physics. To reach this airbase, they had to cross 1,200 miles deep inside Russia and pass through a multi-layered air defense network described as nearly unbeatable. The greatest threat lay 20 miles west of Shegol, the Nebo-U radar operated by Russia's 14th Air Defense Corps. The system's low-frequency VHF waves allowed it to detect targets with small radar cross-sections, such as UAVs, at ranges of up to 500 miles more effectively than many higher-band radars. However, that same characteristic was also its fatal weakness. VHF waves do not offer high resolution, meaning Nebo-U could only identify the general area where a target appeared, not provide enough precision to directly guide a weapon. As a result, the information had to be passed to dedicated fire control radars, creating a delay that the Liutyi formation could exploit to push deeper. For that reason, the Liutyi formation continued breaking through the first surveillance layer. By 04:26 hours local time, infrared thermal cameras began scanning the target area, while artificial intelligence automatically identified, locked onto, and tracked priority targets. These UAVs had not come only to strike Shegol Air Base. They were trying to blind the eyes of the air defense system protecting Chelyabinsk. The first target locked by Ukraine's artificial intelligence was not the runway or the aircraft hangars. It was the S-400 Triumph air defense system protecting Shegol Air Base. Shegol is a pilot training base of the Chelyabinsk Red Banner Military Aviation Academy, and also hosts bomber and reconnaissance regiments operating Su-24s, Su-34s, and 26s and Mi-8 helicopters. To protect a target of such value, Russia had deployed what it considered one of its strongest multi-layered air defense shields. In theory, the S-400's 91N6E Big Bird surveillance radar can detect targets at a range of 300 miles. Its 92N6E fire control radar can track 250 targets at the same time, while the 48N6E3 missiles can intercept at ranges of up to 150 miles and altitudes of 100,000 feet. In reality, Russian officers believed the Ukrainian UAV formation should have been detected from far away, but physics was on the side of the Liutyi drones. At an altitude of 250 feet, the radar horizon becomes an invisible wall. For a ground-based radar, a low-flying target often appears only when it is a few dozen miles away, and in many conditions, only about 25 miles away. Far less than the 250-mile figure advertised for the S-400. Ukraine exploited this weakness deeply. These UAVs were not flying through the S-400. They were flying beneath its practical line of sight. It is like standing on a beach and looking at ships far out at sea. You cannot see the waves directly beneath your feet. Even when the 92N6E radar finally saw the targets, the problem was not over. The S-400's X-band fire control radar is highly effective against high-flying fighter jets. But when facing small UAVs skimming close to the ground, it has to filter through countless reflections from workshops, trees, metal rooftops, and terrain around the base. The very precision of its shorter wavelength turns the ground into a complex field of signal clutter. More importantly, by the time the Liutyi drones appeared clearly on the radar screen, they had already entered a range where the S-400's long-range advantage meant very little. A missile still needs about 6 seconds to leave the launcher, stabilize its trajectory, and reach optimal maneuverability. With the targets appearing so close, Russia could not practically launch a $2 million missile to chase a $100,000 drone. The next defensive layer was the S-350 Liutyi, a system deployed to intercept low-flying targets and protect the S-400 batteries themselves. Its multifunction radar can track multiple targets simultaneously, while its 9 M96 missiles can destroy targets at distances of up to 30 miles. But at Shegol, the issue was no longer range. The issue was time. From detection to launch, the crew still had to complete a chain of steps. Confirm the target, transmit the data, rotate the launcher, and fire the missile. The entire process may take only a few seconds, but against UAVs closing in at 100 miles per hour, every second rapidly shrinks the interception window. On a map, Shegol was covered by almost complete air defense circles. But in the real world, those circles were bent by low flight altitude, the radar horizon, ground clutter, and reaction time. Ukraine did not need to defeat Russia's entire air defense system. It only needed to force that system to see the targets when it was already too late, and by then everything truly was too late. At 04:35 hours local time, the first 9 AN-196 Liutyi drones split into 2 groups just before entering Shagol Air Base. 4 suddenly turned toward the S-400 position, driving straight at the 9-2 N-6E fire control radar, the launch vehicles, and the supporting equipment clustered around them. The remaining 5 held their altitude at 250 feet and continued toward the airfield area. The S-350 Vityaz immediately recognized the threat closing in on the S-400 and reacted at once. 4 9M96 missiles left their launchers in sequence, accelerated to Mach 4, and raced toward the 4 incoming Liutyi drones. The first 2 were hit and shattered before they could reach the position, but the remaining 2 had flown low enough, close enough, and were partially masked by ground clutter from the surrounding structures. The third drone slammed directly into the 9-2 N-6E fire control radar. The fourth struck the command vehicle area and supporting equipment just behind it. 2 explosions tore through the air defense position in succession. The 9-2 N-6E radar disappeared behind a column of fire while auxiliary equipment around the S-400 was swept by fragments. A long-range sky control system had been taken down at its weakest point. In the final 6 miles before the base, the S-400 still had missiles, but without its fire control radar, it was almost useless. It knew where the targets were, but it could no longer guide its shots accurately. More importantly, the 4 Liutyi drones had pulled the S-350 back to defend the S-400. At the same time, the 5 remaining drones slipped through the air defense layer and drove straight into Shagol Air Base. Their target was not the aircraft sitting out on the apron. The artificial intelligence on board the UAVs locked onto an AN-26 aircraft hangar near the taxiway. The AN-26 is a twin-engine military transport aircraft used to move troops, equipment, and cargo between bases. But inside a hangar, the aircraft itself was only part of the larger target. Around it were maintenance equipment, spare parts, towing vehicles, and large amounts of flammable material concentrated inside the same enclosed space. The first Liutyi punched through the hangar roof. Its warhead detonated inside, driving pressure up to 30 pounds per square inch and trapping fragments inside the structure before blasting the metal doors outward. Only 5 seconds later, the next drone struck the remaining sections of the hangar and the equipment area beside it. Fire quickly spread along the body of the AN-26. Technical oil containers, wiring, and maintenance equipment ignited, turning the hangar into a giant furnace. A 140-foot column of black smoke began spilling across the taxiway, obscuring part of the airfield. Only then did the S-350 crew realize the problem. The 50N-6E radar immediately swung back to scan the airfield area. The combat crews tried to re-establish tracking and protect the hangar, the taxiway, and the remaining structures. But the attack was not over. That was only the opening act of that morning. 7 more AN-196 Liutyi drones appeared at extremely low altitude, entering Shagol from another approach direction. This time, the targets were the base's maintenance zone and fuel storage area. The S-350 immediately shifted to counter them, but after firing to protect the S-400, then turning back to defend the airfield, the system had to keep switching targets inside an environment filled with smoke, fire, and reflected signals. On the radar screen, the 7 Liutyi drones flickered in and out among workshops, ground vehicles, and metal structures. They did not form a fixed formation. Instead, they split in multiple directions, forcing the radar to divide its tracking lines and forcing the crew to decide which target was the most dangerous. While the S-350 was still trying to classify the signals, 2 Liutyi drones had already reached the maintenance zone. One struck a workshop row containing repair equipment. The other exploded near the spare parts staging area and technical vehicles. The final 4 continued toward the fuel depot through the cold smoke covering the airfield. Their electro-optical sensors easily identified the tanks in the 500-yard fuel pipeline network. These targets were fixed on the ground, forming large, clear shapes inside the image recognition system. The first Liutyi struck the pipeline area. The second exploded near a 50,000-liter fuel tank, creating a fire that rapidly spread toward nearby structures. The remaining 2 dove into the hotspots that had just appeared, causing the flames to erupt into a giant orange wall rising 160 feet into the air. In the final seconds, the S-350 tried to react. One 9M96 missile was launched and managed to intercept the last UAV at a distance of 3 miles. But that was all the system could do. The other 3 had already completed their mission. In less than 7 minutes, Shagol was hit in 3 successive layers. The S-400 position was blinded. The N-26 hangar was destroyed. and the maintenance zone and fuel depot were pulled into a chain of explosions. The S-350 had fired 10 missiles but only brought down 5 Liutyi drones. The other 7 broke through the defensive layer and hit their targets. But the attack did not stop there. Russia had used every remaining modern system it had to protect Chigol. Ukraine relied on something simpler: swarm tactics and the mathematics of simultaneous overload. At 4:44 hours local time, 28 AN-196 Liutyi drones appeared around the base. This time, their targets were the Flight Operations Building and the Combat Aircraft Parking Area. In front of the Ukrainian UAVs stood a dense defensive network. The S-350 Liutyi handled the main long-range interception layer with its 50N6E radar and 9 M96 missiles. Kupol-Pro began jamming satellite signals and communication channels in an attempt to disrupt navigation. At the innermost ring, 2 S-38 DEVASTATE PVO systems turned their 57mm guns toward the low approach corridors around the airfield, ready to destroy any UAV that entered close range. And the Ukrainian operators knew this. The 28 Liutyi drones did not charge in as a single formation. They split into 4 groups of 7, approaching the airfield from 4 directions at the same time. More importantly, the UAVs constantly accelerated to 120 miles per hour as they joined formation, then slowed again to 80 miles per hour and swapped positions with one another. The lead drone suddenly slowed, allowing the one behind it to overtake. A UAV on the left wing cut across the formation while another dropped to 280 feet before reappearing at a new approach angle. On Russian radar screens, one track had barely formed before it crossed another signal. A target that had just been assigned a number disappeared into ground clutter, then reappeared in a position the computer believed belonged to a different UAV. The problem was not that the S-350 could not see them. The problem was that the system could not determine fast enough which drone was heading for the Flight Operations Building and which was moving toward the Combat Aircraft Parking Area. As soon as one group was classified, the formation changed. As soon as a track became stable enough for missile guidance, the UAVs swapped positions again. The fire control computer was not defeated by one target that was too difficult. It was dragged into too many shifting swarm calculations at the same time. In an attempt to break the formation, the Russians immediately turned to electronic warfare. Kupol-Pro was activated at high power. The system began locking down satellite frequencies and the communication channels Ukraine commonly used. But when the external signal disappeared, the Liutyi drones automatically switched into autonomous AI mode. Their inertial systems continued calculating the flight path while artificial intelligence compared live camera imagery with reconnaissance data loaded in advance. Runways, warehouses, road junctions, and structures around the airfield became reference points. Kupol-Pro could hide satellite signals, but it could not erase the images on the ground. The jamming intensity even became a double-edged sword. It unintentionally pointed to the battlefield's most important area. Wherever Russia was trying hardest to protect was the place that mattered most, the Combat Aircraft Parking Area, where Russia's modern fighter aircraft were present. As the Russian system tried to lock down the channels normally used by Ukrainian control crews, the Liutyi formation began jumping continuously across 128 different channels. By the time Kupol-Pro identified one frequency, the UAVs had already moved to the next. Inside the inner ring, the 2 S-38 systems began locking targets. But when the 57mm guns turned toward the eastern group, the UAVs immediately widened their formation. 2 climbed higher to draw fire, while the remaining 5 dropped lower and continued closing in. When the S-350 focused on the northern group, the southern group accelerated together. When the radar swung south, the eastern and western groups changed their approach angles. Every Russian air defense system was still functioning as designed, but none of them could respond to every direction at the same time. This was not yet the moment of impact. This was the moment Russia's air defense was being stretched to its limit. Ukraine was forcing each system to look in a different direction during the few decisive seconds that mattered most. Because when an air defense network tries to protect every direction, it begins to reveal the direction that matters most. At 4:48 hours local time, when the Liutyi formation was still 12 miles from Chigol Air Base, the entire Russian air defense network began firing. At the outermost ring, the S-400 Triumph launched 8 missiles in succession. Within seconds, 8 fireballs appeared in the low sky, tearing 8 AN-196 Liutyi drones into burning fragments. As the distance closed, the S-350 Liutyi received tracking data on the 20 remaining drones. 8 9 M96 missiles left their launch tubes, accelerated to Mach 3.8, and raced toward the tracks just established by the 50N6E radar. 7 Liutyi drones were destroyed. The eighth missile exploded at the exact position the UAV group had passed through only moments earlier. Krasuka 4 immediately intensified its jamming. Two UAVs lost their navigation signal, drifted out of formation, and flew toward empty areas outside the airfield. At the innermost ring, the two S-38 DEVASTATE PVO systems began firing. Their 57mm automatic cannons, firing at up to 4,500 rounds per minute, continuously created fragmentation zones across the low approach corridor, taking down 4 more Liutyi drones when they were only a few miles from the base. But 2 other drones did not try to break through. In the final seconds, they dropped lower and charged directly into the 2 DEVASTATE systems that were still firing. The first explosion struck the turret area and the electro-optical sensor cluster. The second swept fragments across the vehicle body and damaged the fire control mechanism, and the final corridor into the airfield was opened. Only a few seconds later, a preliminary report was sent back to the Chagol Air Defense Command post. Most of the formation had been shot down, jammed, or pushed off its approach line. The interception rate was recorded at nearly 90%. On the command screen, it looked like an almost total victory, but the Russians were only counting the UAVs that had disappeared. They did not see the 5 that remained. 5 Liutyi drones had passed through every defensive layer. With less than 1 mile left to the target, they simultaneously climbed to 450 feet and accelerated to 130 miles per hour. At that speed, they needed only 53 seconds to reach impact. The first 2 turned toward the Flight Operations Building, the facility responsible for controlling takeoffs, landings, and mission assignments across the base. The first drone dived into the eastern section of the roof. Its warhead penetrated the light structure before detonating inside, generating a 30-pound per square inch shockwave that swept through the operations rooms, shattering glass panels, electrical boards, and communications equipment. The second struck the antenna cluster and electrical system beside the building. Cable lines were severed and the backup power ran for only a few seconds before the technical area caught fire. The operations building was not completely flattened, but its ability to coordinate the airfield as a unified system had been paralyzed. The remaining 3 drones continued toward the combat aircraft parking area, where Su-24s, Su-34s, An-26s, and Mi-8 helicopters sat on. The concrete beside towing vehicles, maintenance equipment, and refueling trucks. In the air, these aircraft could maneuver and disperse, but on the ground, they were large, fixed, and easy to identify. The first Liutyi struck a refueling truck parked near a Su-24 position. The tank was ripped open, spraying thousands of liters of fuel into a mist before it ignited. In less than 1 second, the fire spread across the concrete, engulfing the landing gear and lower fuselage of the aircraft. The second drone exploded near the Su-34 area. The shockwave threw spare parts, containers, and technical vehicles into the air while hundreds of metal fragments punched through the wings, rear fuselage, and control surfaces. The final drone dived near the parking area for the An-26 and Mi-8 helicopters. The explosion created a third fire point and blocked the route that fire trucks needed to reach the first 2 burning zones. Within 2 seconds, 3 fires appeared across the parking area at the same time. Black smoke quickly rose 100 feet into the air, covering part of the taxiway and dividing the alert aircraft area into multiple danger zones. The fire crews were no longer facing a single blaze. They had to choose between the operations building losing power, the Su-24 and Su-34 areas burning, and the An-26 and Mi-8 parking area now hidden behind black smoke. By 4:50 hours local time, the southern section of Chagol Air Base had turned into a sea of fire. On paper, Russia had intercepted nearly 90% of the UAVs involved in the strike. But on the ground, the 5 that got through were enough to paralyze the Flight Operations Building, ignite fires across the combat aircraft parking area, and disrupt the entire base. That is the paradox of modern air defense. A system can win almost every individual interception and still fail at its most important mission, protecting the target behind it. As Russian soldiers began dragging fire hoses across the taxiway, officers inside the command post believed the raid was over, but they had no idea that 5 other Liutyi drones had separated from the formation earlier. They had deliberately slowed down during the approach, stretching the interval by nearly 2 minutes. While every Russian radar, air defense weapon, and ground unit was being pulled toward the first fires, these 5 small signals were still silently moving toward Chagol at an altitude of only 35 feet. At exactly 4:52 hours local time, a new warning appeared. By then, the 5 UAVs were only 2 miles from the Chagol command area. The defenders immediately activated Kupol-Pro in emergency mode. The system began creating an invisible jamming dome around the protected area, saturating satellite navigation signals and control channels within a 3-mile radius. In the first few seconds, it worked immediately. The 2 lead Liutyi drones suddenly lost their navigation signal. On the control screen, their coordinates began drifting 400 yards away from their actual flight path. The operators tried to correct the approach, but every command they sent was distorted or disappeared inside the jamming zone. One drone banked hard to the left, drifted away from the base, and crashed into an open field beside the airfield. The other misidentified a cluster of auxiliary buildings and exploded nearly half a mile from the main target. 2 blasts rang out beyond the base perimeter. Inside the command post, the Russians believed Kupol-Pro had stopped the final wave. But the 3 remaining drones had switched to a completely different guidance method. The moment external signals disappeared, the artificial intelligence system automatically took over. Inertial data continued measuring speed, heading, and attitude, while the forward camera began comparing the real terrain below with the airfield map loaded in advance. The UAVs no longer asked, "What are my coordinates?" They asked a simpler question: which part of the base does the scene below match? At a processing speed of 30 frames per second, the computer continuously identified roof edges, internal roads, concrete aprons, hangar shadows, pipe clusters, and heat zones standing out in the cold air. Kupol-Pro could make GPS disappear, but it could not erase the real shape of Chelyabinsk from the ground. Below, Russian soldiers began firing AK-74 rifles. Bursts of 5.45mm rounds cut short streaks through the low sky, but the targets were small, fast-moving, and appearing through black smoke, making aiming almost entirely a matter of reflex. Other soldiers used handheld Stupor anti-UAV guns. The device projected a directional jamming beam designed to cut the control channel and satellite signal of the target. But by then, the Liutyi drones were no longer receiving commands from an operator, and they no longer depended on GPS. The jamming beams were still being fired, but they were locking onto channels the UAVs were no longer using. The 3 Liutyi drones continued dropping lower, piercing through the smoke covering the taxiways. Only 4 seconds later, they split in 3 different directions. The first drone raced toward the airfield command building. Its warhead struck the upper section of the structure, punched through the roof, and detonated inside the communications area. The shockwave traveled through enclosed corridors, shattering glass doors, electrical cabinets, and coordination panels. Several cable lines were severed immediately while the backup power system stayed alive for only a few seconds before smoke flooded the technical section. The final 2 UAVs continued toward the aircraft parking area. There, 2 Su-57 fighters sat motionless on the concrete, surrounded by towing vehicles, maintenance equipment, and technical lines. In the air, a fighter jet can maneuver at hundreds of miles per hour. But on the ground, it is only a large target that cannot defend itself. The second Liutyi struck near the wing of the first Su-57. The explosion deformed the wing edge, tore open outer panels, and swept metal fragments through the landing gear area. Fuel and technical oil began leaking onto the concrete before igniting from burning debris. The final drone slammed into the center fuselage of the remaining aircraft. The shockwave traveled along the airframe, damaging electronic bays and blowing off multiple external panels. Within seconds, fire appeared around the mid-fuselage and began spreading toward the tail, where auxiliary systems and fuel lines were densely concentrated. In less than 1 minute, the fire spread through leaking fuel, aircraft tires, composite materials, and nearby technical vehicles. Temperatures at several points exceeded 800 degrees Celsius, enough to deform aluminum alloys, destroy circuit boards, and render many electronic components impossible to recover. Black smoke kept rising, covering the taxiway and reducing visibility to only a few hundred feet. Warning sirens, infantry fire, and secondary explosions merged together, turning the southern section of Chelyabinsk into complete chaos. By 0454 hours local time, the final wave had truly ended. On the ground, the flight operations building had lost its ability to coordinate. Multiple aircraft parking areas were burning, and rescue operations were split between too many fire points. That is the difference between destruction and paralysis. Destruction means creating an explosion. Paralysis means throwing the entire base into chaos, leaving it unable to decide which part must be saved first. The consequences of the strike were not limited to the columns of smoke covering Chelyabinsk. At least 4 aircraft were directly affected, including 2 Su-57s, 1 Su-34, and 1 unidentified aircraft. With each Su-57 estimated to cost between $100 million and $120 million United States dollars, and each Su-34 around $35 million to $50 million United States dollars, the total damage could exceed $250 million United States dollars if the aircraft were seriously damaged. But the real loss is greater than money. Russia possesses only a limited number of Su-57s. Each aircraft requires years of production, specialized components, and thousands of labor hours. That means taking just 2 of them out of combat service is enough to create a significant gap in Russia's air force. The strike also disrupted operations at Shegol, forcing Russia to disperse aircraft, move them into hardened shelters, or relocate them to other bases. That lengthens maintenance cycles, reduces the number of aircraft ready for sorties, and directly affects the tempo of airstrikes against Ukraine. But the greatest significance lies in the distance. Shegol is located more than 1,200 miles from the Ukrainian border. Using long-range UAVs developed by Ukraine itself, Ukraine proved that even bases near the Ural Mountains are no longer safe rear areas. The raid also exposed the gaps in Russia's air defense network. S-400s, S-350S, electronic warfare systems, and anti-aircraft guns shot down most of the UAVs, but only a small number getting through was enough to cause strategic damage. Russia's Federal Security Service claimed that the attack had been stopped. And if judged only by the number of UAVs shot down, that might look like a clean report. But the columns of smoke over Shegol told a different story. A raid is not judged by how many UAVs were destroyed, but by whether the ones that survived completed their mission. When the operations building is paralyzed and strategic aircraft are hit, it is very difficult to call that attack a failure. Militarily, Ukraine weakened Russia's airstrike capability. Psychologically, it broke the sense of safety deep inside Russian territory, and strategically, it forced Moscow to spread more air defenses across a vast territory. Ukraine did not just strike Shegol, it struck the very idea of Russia's safe zone. What do you think Moscow will do next? Disperse its aircraft, reinforce air defenses in the rear, or take a long-term ceasefire agreement more seriously? Leave your thoughts below. Goodbye.